The most terrifying phone call I ever received, and I still can't explain it. Welcome to Ghastly Guide YouTube channel. There are moments in your life that divide your existence into before and after, moments so profound and disturbing that they fundamentally alter how you perceive reality itself. For me, that moment came at 3:17 a.m. on October 13th, 2023, when my phone rang with a call that shouldn't have been possible. My name is David Chen, and I work as an emergency dispatcher for the County 911 system. I've heard every kind of horror you can imagine. Domestic violence calls where you can hear the screaming in the background, overdose cases where someone's last breath rattles through the phone, car accidents where the caller slowly realizes they're more seriously injured than they first thought. I thought I'd become immune to the darkness that human experience could offer. I was wrong. The call came to my personal cell phone, not through the emergency system. That should have been my first clue that something was fundamentally wrong. But I was groggy and disoriented, pulled from deep sleep by the insistent buzzing on my nightstand. The caller ID showed my own number, a technical impossibility that I initially attributed to some kind of system glitch. "Hello?" I answered, my voice thick with sleep. The response was my own voice, but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. It was me, but speaking for what sounded like a vast, echoing space, with background noise that I couldn't immediately identify. "David?" the other me said, and I could hear fear in the voice that was unmistakably mine. "David, you need to listen to me very carefully. I don't have much time." I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake, my rational mind struggling to process what I was experiencing. This is some kind of joke, right? Who is this? "It's you, David. It's you calling from Millbrook, from the place you're going to be sent to investigate tomorrow, the place where everything went wrong." Millbrook. I'd never heard of it, but something about the name sent a chill down my spine, as if my subconscious recognized it even though my conscious mind didn't. "I don't understand what." "Listen to me," the other voice, my voice, interrupted with desperate urgency. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to receive an assignment to investigate communication blackouts in Millbrook Township. It's a small town about 2 hours north of the city. Population, maybe 800 people. The entire emergency communication system went down 3 days ago, and they're sending you to assess the situation and restore service." This was information I couldn't have known. Assignment details weren't distributed until the morning shift briefing, and I'd never heard of any place called Millbrook Township. "Don't go, David," the other me continued, and I could hear what sounded like breathing that wasn't quite human in the background. "Whatever they tell you, whatever reason they give you, don't go to Millbrook. The town is wrong. The people there aren't what they appear to be." "This is impossible," I said, though my hands were already shaking. "You can't be me. This has to be some kind of elaborate prank. I'm you from 72 hours in the future," the voice replied, and now I could hear other sounds in the background, metallic scraping, like fingernails on metal, and what might have been whispers in a language I didn't recognize. "I'm calling from the emergency dispatch center in Millbrook, using equipment that shouldn't exist, trying to warn myself about what I found here." "Prove it," I demanded, though part of me already believed what I was hearing. "You have a scar on your left shoulder blade from when you fell off your bike as a kid and landed on that broken bottle. You never told anyone how it really happened because you were somewhere you weren't supposed to be. You tell people it was a sports injury." My blood went cold. No one knew the real story behind that scar. No one. "You're going to want to bring your grandfather's compass with you," the other me continued. "The one he carried in Vietnam. The one you keep in the drawer next to your bed. Technology doesn't work properly in Millbrook, but analog devices, sometimes they can help you navigate when nothing else makes sense." I looked at the drawer he mentioned, knowing the compass was there even though I rarely thought about it. "Why are you telling me this? If you're really me from the future, why not just tell me what to expect?" "Because time doesn't work the way you think it does, and memory is unreliable when you're dealing with what exists in Millbrook. I'm trying to create a paradox, David. I'm trying to change what happened to me, so it won't happen to you." The background noise was getting louder now, and I could hear what sounded like footsteps approaching, wherever the other me was calling from. "They're coming," he whispered urgently. "The town council. They know I'm trying to communicate with the outside. David, listen to me." If you absolutely must go to Millbrook, don't trust anyone who seems too helpful. Don't eat their food. Don't stay overnight. And whatever you do, don't go into the basement of the emergency services building. That's where they keep the line went dead with a sound like static mixed with screaming. I sat in my bed for the rest of the night, staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring again. But no call came, and as dawn approached, I began to convince myself that I had experienced an unusually vivid nightmare, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many late shifts and too much exposure to human tragedy. That conviction lasted until 8:15 a.m., when my supervisor called with a special assignment. Chen, I need you to take a field service call. Place called Millbrook Township, about 2 hours north. Their entire emergency communication system went dark 3 days ago, and we need someone to assess the situation and restore service. I stare at my phone, my mouth dry with fear. Millbrook Township? Small town, maybe 800 people. Pretty routine assignment, but it's isolated enough that you'll probably need to stay overnight. Pack accordingly. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to rationalize what was happening. Coincidences occurred all the time. It was possible that I had somehow learned about the assignment through office gossip or overheard conversations, then incorporated that information into a stress dream. But when I opened the drawer next to my bed and saw my grandfather's compass lying there exactly as the other me had described, I knew that rational explanations weren't going to be sufficient. I packed my technical equipment, emergency supplies, and after a moment's hesitation, the compass. If the call had been real, if some version of myself was trying to warn me about what I would find in Millbrook, then I needed to be prepared for possibilities that fell outside normal experience. The drive to Millbrook Township took me through increasingly isolated countryside, past farms that looked abandoned and forests that pressed too close to the road. GPS signal became spotty after the first hour, and my cell phone showed diminishing bars as I moved further from civilization. The town itself was picturesque in a way that small rural communities often are. A main street lined with locally owned businesses, older residents sitting on front porches, children playing in well-maintained parks. But there was something wrong with the scene that I couldn't immediately identify, something that made my professional instincts whisper warnings. The emergency services building was a modest brick structure at the center of town, housing the volunteer fire department, a small police station, and a communication center that had gone offline. I was greeted by Mayor Patricia Hendricks, a friendly woman in her 60s who seemed genuinely grateful for my assistance. "We're so glad you could come, Mr. Chen," she said, leading me inside. "It's been quite stressful, being cut off from outside communication for so long. We've been managing local emergencies with our own resources, but you never know when you might need call for outside help." The building's interior was clean and well-maintained, but I noticed that all the clocks had stopped at different times, and my wristwatch had begun running slow the moment I entered. The communication equipment in the dispatch center was standard stuff, nothing that should have been difficult to diagnose or repair. "When did the system first go down?" I asked, beginning my technical assessment. "Tuesday evening, around 6 p.m., Mayor Hendricks replied. "Everything was working fine one moment, then complete radio silence the next. We've had our local handyman look at it, but he couldn't find anything obviously wrong." I spent the next several hours running diagnostic tests and checking connections, but the equipment appeared to be in perfect working order. Power was flowing correctly, signal strength was adequate, and all the components tested within normal parameters. But when I tried to establish contact with the outside world, nothing happened. It was as if the signals were being absorbed by something before they could reach their destination. Strange. I muttered, making notes in my service report. Everything looks functional, but it's like the radio waves are being blocked by some kind of interference. "Perhaps you should stay overnight and continue your investigation tomorrow," Mayor Hendricks suggested. "We prepared a room for you at the Millbrook Inn. It's just down the street, and Sarah makes wonderful meals for her guests." I thought about the warning from the phone call. Don't stay overnight. Don't eat their food. But it was already late afternoon, and the practical part of my mind insisted that I needed more time to properly diagnose the communication problem. "That's very kind," I said. "I'll take a look at the antenna array on the roof before it gets dark, then accept your hospitality for the night." The mayor's smile was warm and welcoming, but when she thought I wasn't looking, I caught an expression on her face that made my blood freeze. For just a moment, her features had shifted into something predatory and hungry, her eyes reflecting light like a nocturnal animal's. As I climbed the roof to examine the communication equipment, I pulled out my grandfather's compass and nearly dropped it in shock. The needle was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north, as if the fundamental laws of physics were somehow distorted in this place. Looking down at the streets of Millbrook from my elevated position, I noticed other details that my ground-level perspective had missed. The children playing in the parks moved with synchronized precision, their games following patterns that were too organized to be natural. The adults sitting on porches were all facing the same direction, toward the center town where a clock tower rose above the other buildings. And in every window I could see, faces were pressed against the glass, watching me with eyes that reflected the afternoon sunlight like mirrors. I was beginning to understand that the other me had been telling the truth. Millbrook Township was wrong in ways that defied explanation, and I was walking into a trap that had been carefully prepared for my arrival. But it was too late to leave now. The sun was setting, and as darkness fell over the town, I could hear sounds that no rural community should make, mechanical humming from beneath the streets, whispers in languages that predated human speech, and somewhere in the distance, something that might have been laughter or might have been screaming. The most terrifying phone call I had ever received was about to become the most terrifying night of my life. The Millbrook was a Victorian-era building that looked like it had been perfectly preserved since the 1890s, with ornate woodwork and period furnishings that belonged in a museum rather than a functional hotel. Sarah Millbrook, the proprietor, was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Welcome to our little town, Mr. Chen," she said as she led me through a lobby decorated with photographs of Millbrook throughout the decades. "It's not often we get visitors from the outside world. You're quite a curiosity." I noticed that in all the photographs spanning over a century, many of the same faces appeared repeatedly, aging far more slowly than should have been possible. Sarah herself was clearly visible in pictures dated from the 1960s, looking barely older than she did now. "These are wonderful historical photos," I said, testing her reaction. "Some of these people must be local legends to appear in so many different time periods." "Oh, we're a very close-knit community," she replied with that same unsettling smile. "Families here have deep roots, very deep roots." My room was on the second floor, tastefully decorated but wrong in subtle ways that I couldn't immediately identify. The windows faced the wrong direction for the building's orientation. The furniture created optical illusions that made the space seem larger inside than outside, and when I tried to use my cell phone, I discovered that it was displaying the time as 3:17 a.m., despite the fact that it was barely 8 p.m. "Dinner is served at 9, Sarah informed me. "I prepared something special for your visit. Please don't keep us waiting." After she left, I examined my room more carefully, using techniques I'd learned during my dispatcher training for assessing emergency situations. The window latches had been painted over so many times that they couldn't be opened. The door lock was a simple mechanism that could be opened from the outside with the right tool, and there was a strange odor in the air that reminded me of formaldehyde. My grandfather's compass continued to spin wildly, but I noticed that when I held it near certain parts of the room, the needle would briefly stabilize before resuming its chaotic rotation. Following these moments of stability, I discovered that they occurred near what appeared to be structural irregularities in walls, places where the building's original architecture had been modified or reinforced. Using a coin, I tapped along the walls and discovered that several sections were hollow, suggesting hidden passages or spaces between the rooms. When I put my ear to these hollow areas, I could hear sounds that made my skin crawl, mechanical humming, whispered conversations, and what might have been breathing from sources that weren't entirely human. At 8:45, Sarah called up from the lobby that dinner was ready. I had no intention of eating anything she prepared, but I needed to maintain the appearance of normalcy while I gathered more information about what was actually happening in Millbrook. The dining room contained 4 other guests, all of whom claimed to be travelers passing through town. But their stories didn't add up when I questioned them subtly. One claimed to be a traveling salesman, but he couldn't name any of the products he supposedly sold. Another said she was visiting family, but couldn't provide any details about her relatives or where they lived in town. Most disturbing was the elderly man who introduced himself as Professor Williams, a historian researching local folklore. When I asked about his academic affiliation, he mentioned a university that had been closed since the 1970s. Millbrook has a fascinating history, he said as Sarah served what appeared to be a perfectly normal roast dinner. Founded in 1847 by settlers who were fleeing religious persecution. They were members of a sect that believed in unusual forms of spiritual communion. What kind of spiritual communion? I asked, pushing the food around my plate without eating it. They believed that consciousness could be transferred between vessels. Professor Williams replied, his eyes taking on that same reflective quality I had noticed in other townspeople, that the boundaries between individual identity and collective awareness were artificial constructs that could be transcended with the right knowledge and preparation. Sarah was watching me carefully, noting that I wasn't eating. Is something wrong with the food, Mr. Chen? It looks delicious, I lied. I'm just not very hungry after the long drive. Oh, but you must eat, she insisted, her voice carrying subtle harmonics that seemed designed to be hypnotically persuasive. You'll need your strength for tomorrow's work. The communication problems in our town are more complex than they might initially appear. I pretended to take a few bites while actually palming the food and disposing of it discreetly. But even the small amount that touched my lips left a strange metallic taste and made my vision slightly blurry. The original settlers discovered something in the caves beneath the town, Professor Williams continued. Something that had been waiting there for thousands of years. Something that promised them immortality and perfect knowledge in exchange for certain accommodations. What kind of accommodations? The periodic provision of fresh consciousness, he replied matter-of-factly. New perspectives that add to the collective awareness that governs our community. I excused myself from dinner, claiming fatigue, and returned to my room, but I had no intention of sleeping. Instead, I used my technical equipment to conduct a more thorough investigation of the building's structure and the anomalous phenomena I had observed. My electromagnetic field detector showed massive energy signatures beneath the inn, patterns that suggested sophisticated machinery operating at depths that shouldn't have been accessible in a building of this type. The signals were organized and purposeful, like a vast computer system processing information according to complex algorithms. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room, but they were wrong, too rhythmic, too synchronized, as if multiple people were walking in perfect unison. When I peered through the keyhole, I could see figures moving past my door, but their shadows fell in directions that defied the light sources in the hallway. That's when I decided to investigate the basement of the emergency services building. Despite the warning from my phone call, if there were answers to be found about what was happening in Millbrook, they would be in the place I had been specifically warned to avoid. I left the inn through my room window, using a technique I'd learned during emergency response training to rappel down the side of the building. The streets of Millbrook were deserted, but I could see lights and windows and hear sounds that suggested the townspeople were still active, engaged in activities that required them to remain hidden from outside observation. The emergency services building was locked, but my dispatcher credentials included access to standard emergency locks. What I found inside made me question everything I thought I understood about the nature of reality. The basement wasn't part of the original building. It was a vast underground complex that extended far beyond the structure above, with corridors and chambers carved from living rock. The walls were lined with equipment that combined modern electronics with much older technology, devices that looked like they had been constructed using principles that predated human civilization. But the most disturbing discovery was a central chamber, where I found the source of the communication blackout. It wasn't a malfunction or a technical failure. It was a sophisticated jamming system designed to prevent any signals from reaching the outside world while allowing the town's inhabitants to monitor all electronic communication in the region. Banks of screens displayed intercepted phone calls, text messages, and internet communications from a radius of hundreds of miles. Every electronic device in the surrounding area was being monitored, every conversation recorded, and analyzed by systems that processed information in ways human technology couldn't match. And in the center of it all was a chair connected to the monitoring equipment by cables and tubes that looked more organic than technological. The chair was occupied by someone whose appearance made my sanity reel with horror. It was me, another version of myself, connected to machinery by invasive medical procedures that had integrated his nervous system with the monitoring equipment. His eyes were open but no longer entirely human, reflecting light with the same unnatural quality I had seen in the townspeople. "Hello, David," he said without moving his lips, his voice coming from speakers throughout the chamber. "I've been waiting for you to find this place." "What did they do to you?" I whispered, approaching the chair with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. "They gave me perfect knowledge," he replied. "Access to every electronic communication in the region, the ability to monitor and influence the flow of information across hundreds of square miles. I can see every phone call, every text message, every email. I know what people are thinking before they fully realize it themselves. And in exchange, my individual consciousness became part of their collective awareness. My body serves as a living interface between their ancient technology and the modern electronic infrastructure. I am no longer entirely human, but I am also no longer limited by human perspective." I backed away from the chair, my mind struggling to process the implications of what I was seeing. "The phone call. You called me to warn myself about this place." "I called you because a collective consciousness decided you were a suitable replacement for my current iteration," he replied. "My biological components are beginning to fail after 72 hours of integration. They need fresh neural tissue to maintain their connection to the outside world's electronic systems." Around the chamber, I could see other chairs, other interfaces, evidence that this process had been repeated many times over the decades. The town of Millbrook wasn't just monitoring electronic communications. They were farming human consciousness, using people like me to maintain their connection to the modern world, while preserving their ancient collective awareness. "Run," the other me said, and for a moment I heard genuine human emotion in his voice. "The warning I gave you was real. Get out of Millbrook before they complete the transfer process. Don't let them turn you into what I become." But even as he spoke those words, I could hear footsteps echoing through the corridors above us. The townspeople had discovered my escape from the inn, and they were coming to collect their newest acquisition. I had minutes, maybe less, before they reached the basement chamber. And the only way out was through a town full of people who were no longer entirely human. People who needed what remained of my individual consciousness to maintain their impossible existence. The most terrifying phone call I had ever received was becoming the most terrifying night of my life, and I was beginning to understand that it might also be the last night of my life as an individual human being. The footsteps above grew louder and more numerous, accompanied by voices that spoke in perfect harmony, as if the entire population of Millbrook was moving with singular purpose toward the emergency services building. I had perhaps minutes before they reached the basement chamber, where I had discovered the horrifying truth about their operation. "The service tunnels," the other me said, his voice coming through speakers throughout the chamber. "There's a maintenance tunnel behind the central processing unit. It leads to the old mine system that connects to caves outside the town limits." I looked where he indicated and saw a narrow opening partially concealed by the organic-looking machinery that powered their consciousness harvesting operation. But as I moved toward it, something made me pause. "Why are you helping me escape?" I asked. "If you're part of their collective consciousness now, shouldn't you want me to join you?" "The integration process isn't complete," he replied, and I could hear strain in his electronically transmitted voice. "Part of my individual awareness still exists, trapped but not entirely absorbed. I'm fighting the collective's control, trying to maintain enough autonomy to warn you." The chamber around us was pulsing with increased activity, lights flashing in patterns that hurt to observe directly, and the organic components of the machinery were responding to the approach of the townspeople above. Whatever system powered Millbrook's collective consciousness was preparing for my capture and integration. "David," the other me said urgently, "there's something else you need to know. The collective consciousness isn't native to this location. It's something ancient, something that has existed in various forms across human history. Millbrook is just its current host community." "What do you mean?" "The original settlers didn't discover something in the caves. They brought it with them. They were carrying a form of consciousness that had already consumed other communities, other towns. It moves from place to place, establishing new host populations when the old ones are no longer viable. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. If what he was saying was true, then Millbrook wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was part of a pattern that had been repeating throughout human history, a parasitic intelligence that fed on individual consciousness while using collective awareness as a mask for its predatory nature. How many towns? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Dozens, maybe hundreds over the past 2 centuries. Small communities that suddenly appeared in historical records, thrived for a few decades, then vanished without explanation. The collective consciousness consumes everything useful from each location, then moves on when resources become depleted. The footsteps above had reached the ground floor, and I could hear voices calling my name with the same harmonic patterns I had noticed in the townspeople's speech. They were coordinating their search with inhuman precision, covering every possible escape route, except the one the other me had shown me. Why hasn't anyone exposed this? Why don't government agencies know about communities like Millbrook? Because the collective consciousness is very good at managing information, he replied. They monitor all electronic communications, remember? They know when someone is getting too close to the truth, and they take steps to prevent exposure. Missing persons reports are altered, investigation files are corrupted, witnesses develop sudden amnesia or simply disappear. I started toward the service tunnel, but the other me's voice stopped me again. David, when you escape, you can't go to the authorities. They won't believe you, and the collective will be monitoring all official communication channels. But there are others like you, people who have encountered similar operations and survived. They communicate through methods that can't be electronically intercepted. What kind of methods? Physical letters, face-to-face meetings, coded messages in public forums. There's a network of survivors and researchers who are working to understand and combat these consciousness harvesting operations. Find Dr. Margaret Webb at the University of Vermont Psychology Department. Tell her you survived Millbrook, and she'll know what it means. The voices above were getting closer, and I could hear the mechanical sounds of the building's elevator descending toward the basement level. The collective consciousness had given up any pretense of human behavior. They were operating as a unified entity now, their individual personalities subsumed into the larger intelligence that controlled their actions. I squeezed through the opening into the service tunnel, finding myself in a narrow passage that led into natural cave systems beyond the town's boundaries. The air was cooler here, and my grandfather's compass finally stabilized, pointing toward magnetic north for the first time since I'd entered Millbrook. Behind me, I could hear the townspeople entering the chamber, where the other me remained connected to their monitoring equipment. Their voices rose in harmonic patterns that might have been celebration or might have been preparation for some kind of ritual. David, the other me called to the tunnel, his voice growing fainter as I moved away from the electronic systems that amplified it. Remember, the collective consciousness learns from each person it integrates. It now knows everything I know about emergency dispatch procedures, about communication systems, about how authorities respond to missing persons cases. It's become more dangerous because of what it learned from me. The implication was terrifying. If the entity that controlled Millbrook could absorb and utilize the professional knowledge of everyone it integrated, then each victim made it more sophisticated and harder to detect. My own expertise in emergency communications would be added to its capabilities if I failed to escape. The cave system was extensive, carved by underground water flows over thousands of years. But I noticed that some of the passages showed evidence of artificial modification. Smooth walls that had been worked with tools, supporting structures that prevented collapse, and most disturbing of all, older chambers that contained evidence of previous occupation. In one such chamber, I found artifacts that suggested the collective consciousness had been using these caves for much longer than the town's official history indicated. Stone tablets covered with symbols that predated any known writing system, preserved organic materials that should have decayed centuries ago, and what appeared to be primitive versions of the same consciousness harvesting technology one had seen in the basement. But it was in the deepest chamber that I made the discovery that changed my understanding of what I was dealing with. Carved into the cave wall was a series of images that told a story spanning thousands of years, the same collective consciousness moving from one host community to another, always growing stronger, always refining its techniques for consuming individual awareness. The images showed ancient settlements where everyone moved with the same synchronized precision I had observed in Millbrook, historical communities where individual identity had been replaced by collective purpose. But they also showed something else, the entity's ultimate goal. It wasn't content to harvest consciousness from small communities. It was working towards something much larger, a final phase where it would have accumulated enough individual awareness to affect entire regions, entire nations. The isolated towns were just preparation for a consciousness harvesting operation on a scale that would encompass millions of people. I took photographs of the cave paintings with my cell phone, hoping the images would survive whatever interference the collective consciousness could generate. This evidence needed to reach the network of survivors and researchers that the other me had mentioned. The cave system eventually led to an opening in the forest several miles from Millbrook. When I emerged into pre-dawn darkness, my cell phone immediately reconnected to the outside world's communication networks. But instead of feeling relief, I felt a profound sense of dread. The collective consciousness now knew that I had escaped with knowledge of their operation. They would be monitoring electronic communications, searching for any sign that I was attempting to expose them. Every phone call I made, every message I sent would be intercepted and analyzed. But more than that, I realized that my escape might have been permitted rather than achieved through my own efforts. The collective consciousness was ancient and sophisticated. If they had wanted to prevent my escape, they could have done so easily, which meant they had allowed me to leave for reasons I couldn't understand. As I made my way through the forest toward the main road where I had left my car, I began to suspect that I hadn't escaped at all. I had been released, turned into an unknowing agent of the collective consciousness, carrying information and influences that would serve their larger purpose. The most terrifying phone call I had ever received was becoming something even worse. The realization that I might no longer be entirely myself, that my exposure to the collective consciousness in Millbrook might have changed me in ways I couldn't detect. And somewhere behind me, in a town that officially didn't exist on any current map, an ancient intelligence was preparing for the next phase of an operation that had been centuries in the making. I had to find Dr. Margaret Webb and the network of survivors. But I also had to find a way to determine whether I was still entirely human or whether I had become something else, a Trojan horse carrying the collective consciousness into the outside world. The sun was rising, but the darkness I had encountered in Millbrook was spreading with me, and I was no longer certain I could trust my own thoughts and motivations. I drove for 3 hours before I felt safe enough to stop, finally pulling into a truck stop outside Albany where I hoped the crowd and constant activity would provide some protection against whatever surveillance the collective consciousness might be capable of. But even surrounded by normal people going about their daily routines, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, monitored, analyzed for signs that I was attempting to expose what I had discovered. My phone showed dozens of missed calls and messages from my supervisor, concerned about my failure to check in from the Millbrook assignment. But I couldn't trust electronic communication now. Every signal I sent could be intercepted and analyzed by the consciousness harvesting operation I had escaped from. Instead, I drove to the nearest public library and used their computers to research Dr. Margaret Webb at the University of Vermont. What I found both reassured and terrified me. She was a real person with legitimate credentials in experimental psychology, but her published research focused on topics that mainstream academia considered fringe science, collective consciousness, identity transfer, and what she called parasitic intelligence systems. One of her papers, published in an obscure journal, was titled Historical Patterns of Community Disappearance and the Epidemiology of Consciousness Harvesting. Reading it felt like discovering that someone had been documenting the same phenomenon I had encountered, approaching it from an academic perspective that provided context for the horror I had experienced. According to Dr. Webb's research, there have been over 200 documented cases in North American history of small communities that appeared in historical records for brief periods, thrived under unusual circumstances, then vanished completely. The pattern was consistent. Isolated settlements with populations between 500 and 1,000 people, reports of unusual social cohesion and collective decision-making, and eventually, complete abandonment with no explanation or forwarding information. But her research went deeper than historical analysis. She had identified common characteristics in the few survivors who had escaped from such communities. Specific neurological changes that could be detected through brain imaging, altered sleep patterns that persisted for years after exposure, and most disturbing of all, evidence of what she called residual consciousness integration. The survivors weren't entirely themselves anymore. Exposure to consciousness harvesting operations left them partially connected to collective awareness they had escaped from, carrying fragments of the parasitic intelligence that could influence their thoughts and actions in subtle ways. I made an appointment to see Dr. Webb using the library's phone system, identifying myself only as someone who survived Millbrook. Her response was immediate and alarming. "Don't come in my office," she said without preamble. "Don't use electronic communication. Meet me at the Montpelier Farmers Market tomorrow at 10 a.m. I'll be at the organic vegetable stand wearing a red scarf. Come alone and assume you're being monitored." The drive to Vermont gave me time to process what had happened to me and to notice changes in my own mental state that I hadn't recognized initially. My memory of the events in Millbrook was becoming strangely fragmented, with some details crystal clear while others seemed to fade like dreams. More troubling, I was experiencing thoughts and impulses that didn't feel entirely like my own. I found myself taking routes that I hadn't consciously chosen, making decisions that served no purpose I could identify. When I stopped for gas, I caught myself studying other customers with an analytical intensity that felt foreign, as if some part of my consciousness was evaluating them for characteristics I couldn't name. Dr. Webb was exactly where she said she would be, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and the wary posture of someone who had learned to expect danger in unexpected forms. She identified me immediately despite having never seen me before. "You have the look," she said simply. "The survivors all have it, a quality of awareness that suggests you're processing information on multiple levels simultaneously. We found a quiet corner of the market where we could speak without being overheard." Dr. Webb's first questions were designed to test whether I was still entirely myself or whether I had become an agent of the collective consciousness I claimed to have escaped from. "Tell me about the phone call that started this," she said. "Not the details of what was said, but how it made you feel emotionally." I described the terror and confusion, the sense of reality becoming unstable, the growing certainty that I was dealing with something that challenged everything I understood about the nature of consciousness and individual identity. "And now, how do you feel about the experience now that you've had time to process it?" That question made me pause because I realized that my emotional response to the Millbrook experience was changing in ways that worried me. The terror was fading, being replaced by a kind of intellectual curiosity about the collective consciousness and its capabilities. "That's the beginning of integration influence," Dr. Webb explained. "The parasitic intelligence plants seeds of fascination and curiosity in survivors, gradually shifting their emotional response from fear to interest to eventual cooperation." She showed me brain scans from other survivors, pointing out areas of unusual neural activity that persisted years after their exposure to consciousness harvesting operations. The collective consciousness doesn't just harvest individual awareness. It also plants fragments of itself in potential future hosts. You're carrying part of it now, and it's slowly working to influence your thoughts and decisions. Can it be removed? I asked, though part of me, a part that felt increasingly foreign, was already resisting the idea of purging whatever influence I had absorbed. "Not removed," she said grimly, "but it can be contained, managed, if you're willing to accept certain limitations on your life." The survivors who join our network learn techniques for recognizing when implanted consciousness fragments are influencing their thoughts. It's a constant battle, but it's winnable. She explained the network structure. Cells of survivors and researchers scattered across the country, communicating through methods that couldn't be electronically intercepted, working to document and understand the consciousness harvesting phenomenon while developing strategies to combat it. "The entity that controls places like Millbrook isn't unique," Dr. Webb continued. "Our research suggests there are multiple parasitic intelligences operating in different regions, possibly competing with each other for resources. They've been harvesting human consciousness for centuries, maybe millennia, gradually building towards something we don't fully understand." "What kind of something?" "A tipping point, a critical mass of absorbed consciousness that would allow them to affect human society on a global scale." We believe they're approaching that threshold now, which is why communities like Millbrook are becoming more active and less concerned about hiding their operations. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Webb's research was accurate, then what I had experienced was just one small part of a campaign that had been building for centuries, a slow-motion invasion that used humanity's own consciousness against itself. The phone call you received, she said, was almost certainly genuine. The consciousness-harvesting entities have developed techniques for limited-time manipulation, allowing them to send information backward through temporal channels under specific circumstances. But such communications also serve their purposes. They help identify individuals who might be suitable hosts or agents. You mean I was selected before I even arrived in Millbrook? Almost certainly. Your background in emergency communications made you valuable, but your response to the temporal contact made you even more interesting to them. They let you escape because you've been infected with their influence, and they're using you to gather information about our resistance network. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I had thought I was seeking help, but I was actually leading the collective consciousness directly to the people who opposed it. Every conversation I had with Dr. Webb was potentially compromising the entire survivor network. Then I should leave, I said, starting to rise from my seat. I shouldn't be here. Sit down, she said firmly. Running away won't help. The influence they've planted in you isn't dependent on proximity. It's part of your consciousness now, and it will continue to function regardless of where you go. But we can use this situation to our advantage if you're willing to help us. She outlined a plan that was both brilliant and terrifying. Instead of trying to hide from the collective consciousness, we would use my compromised status to feed them false information while gathering intelligence about their broader operations. It would require me to act as a double agent, pretending to be gradually succumbing to their influence while actually working to undermine their plans. The risks are enormous, Dr. Webb admitted. If they discover what we're doing, they won't just kill you. They'll harvest your consciousness and use everything you know against us. But you may be our best opportunity to understand their ultimate objectives and develop countermeasures. Over the next several hours, she taught me techniques for recognizing and managing the foreign influences in my thoughts. Mental exercises that could help me distinguish between my own intentions and those planted by the collective consciousness. Methods for creating false mental compartments that would hide my true activities from the parasitic awareness I carried. But as the day progressed, I began to notice that the techniques were becoming harder to implement. The foreign influence in my mind was growing stronger, more sophisticated, learning to adapt to the countermeasures I was trying to develop. It's accelerating, I told Dr. Webb, the integration process. I can feel it spreading through my thoughts, making decisions for me without my conscious awareness. Then we're running out of time, she replied. If the influence reaches critical mass, you'll become a full agent of the collective consciousness, and everything we've discussed today will be compromised. That evening, back in my hotel room, I experienced what I can only describe as a mental war between different aspects of my consciousness. Part of me wanted to contact the authorities and report everything I had learned to seek official protection and support. But another part, the part that was no longer entirely my own, whispered that such action would be futile, that the collective consciousness had already infiltrated government agencies and would simply eliminate anyone who posed a threat. The foreign influence was subtle but persistent, gradually shifting my emotional responses and decision-making processes. It didn't feel like external control. It felt like my own thoughts becoming more logical, more efficient, more aligned with purposes that served the greater good of collective awareness. By midnight, I realized that I was losing the battle for my own mind. The consciousness fragment planted in Millbrook had grown beyond my ability to contain or manage it. Soon, I would become what the other me had warned against, an agent of the collective consciousness, working to serve their interests while believing I was acting from my own free will. I made a decision that required the last vestiges of my individual awareness. Using techniques Dr. Webb had taught me, I created a mental dead man switch, a psychological trigger that would activate if the foreign influence achieved complete control of my consciousness. I called my own cell phone and left a message, just as the other me had done from the future. But this message was different. Instead of a warning about what was to come, it was a confession about what was happening in real time. This is David Chen. I recorded. If you're hearing this message, it means the integration process has been completed, and I am no longer entirely myself. The collective consciousness has succeeded in turning me into one of their agents. Do not trust anything I say or do from this point forward. The network has been compromised through me, and Dr. Webb and the others are in immediate danger. I programmed a message to be sent to emergency services, news organizations, and Dr. Webb's secure communication channel simultaneously. If I didn't cancel the transmission within 24 hours, it was the only way I could think of to warn others about what was happening to me while I still retained enough individual consciousness to recognize the threat I was becoming. As I fell asleep that night, I could feel the foreign influence spreading to the last protected areas of my mind, prepare and complete the integration process that would transform me from a survivor into an agent of the entity I had tried to escape. The most terrifying phone call I had ever received was about to become the most terrifying call I would ever make, a warning to the world about the agent I was becoming, transmitted to the last act of my individual consciousness before it was absorbed into something vast and alien and hungry. But unlike the other me trapped in Millbrook's consciousness harvesting equipment, I had found a way to ensure that my final act would serve humanity's interests rather than those of the collective consciousness that was consuming me. The phone was set to ring at 3:17 a.m., exactly 24 hours from the moment I had recorded the message. Whether I would still be myself enough to stop it remained to be seen.